Hey everyone, in this video we're going to cover what does Firebase offer and what are some of its downsides. This is not a very technical video, it should just be easy listening here. Firebase is a set of services offered by Google, and in their own words they say you can build apps fast without managing infrastructure. I think they've done a really good job at succinctly capturing that value proposition, which is that you can be a developer. You don't need to be ops, you don't need to be DevOps, you can just get started building your app or your site. I'm going to cover the main features that they offer at a high level in this video, but some of the other videos in this course will dive deeper into what these features are. Hosting is for hosting static content, images, HTML, JavaScript that your site might have. Storage is for user-generated content, typically things that are too big to fit into the database, like a user-uploaded photo or maybe a video that they've uploaded. Authentication is identifying who a user is. This is anything from an email and password combination to a login with Twitter button to using your phone or a magic email link. Firebase offers all of those. There are two different databases that they offer. They are schema-less databases. I'll talk about those more in another video. There's Cloud Functions, which lets you run arbitrary code on Google servers. And then there are some other offerings here. Firebase is technically part of Google Cloud Platform, GCP. And that means that you can access anything that GCP offers. However, I like this distinction between Firebase's offerings, these main ones that I've listed here, and GCP, because a lot of other cloud platforms will throw something like 40 services at you. And you need to wade through documentation to figure out what's the paradigmatic way of doing things. Firebase keeps all of this up front and things are relatively straightforward as I've described here. If you want user uploaded content, you'd probably throw that into storage. Let's go back to those words from earlier, build apps fast, and focus on the without managing infrastructure part. In order to understand all of what Firebase is doing for you, I'm going to quickly go through a few different eras of hosting sites. Let's start with a physical machine. There are a lot of pros and cons of this. It's not like we're not out of this era. There are still companies hosting on physical machines. But if you wanted to, let's say in the 70s or 80s, host a site, you would typically have just gotten a machine or a server rack and you would have paid up front for it. You would have had to manage all of the hardware. You'd be in one physical location. Again, I'm not going to cover everything here. I've got some bullet points. And in exchange, you would have full control over that machine. If you wanted to use 100% of the CPU all the time until it burned out, you could do that. Era number 2 is having virtual machines or VMs. And you would typically rent these by the month or by the hour or the minute. You could run them anywhere in the world. You could scale up and down more easily, but there's still some management that you have to do. You have to control what programs are running, what operating system you have, and you have to orchestrate your own fleet of VMs. When do you scale up? When do you scale down? Era number 3 is serverless or cloud computing. And both of those are kind of buzzwords. You still have servers, but you're not the one who's managing any of those. Let's go back to Cloud Functions as an example. Let's say you have a function that zips a bunch of images and produces that archive for users. You are calling this 1,000 times per minute. And you don't need to worry about how many instances is Firebase managing for you. When you finally scale up to 2,000 times per minute, you don't need to provision those new machines. All you care about is writing that code and passing it over to Firebase and letting it handle everything for you. This leads to a completely different way of thinking because now Firebase is managing everything for you from scalability to deploying that code somewhere else, and all you need to focus on are some different coding paradigms behind this. For example, consider giving your users direct access to a database. To me, before Firebase, that sounded crazy. What's to stop users from going in, writing other people's rows for deleting content? This was a bad idea to me. What I was used to envisioning was something where you'd have a server in between. This server would do authentication, make sure that the user is who they say they are, and then authorization to make sure that they have access to whatever rows they're trying to modify or delete. With Firebase, you don't have to worry about that intermediate server. It's completely fine to give users direct access to everything thanks to security rules in the database. And it's not just the database, you could also give users direct access to Cloud Functions. But in general, you just have direct access from users into this cloud platform. Let's say on your site, you had an About Me section that users could update themselves. They could fill out new data here, they can click submit. How would you do this without something like Firebase? Well, you might expose a REST API. They post into this URL and they can specify a new blurb. You would authenticate the user there to make sure they are who they say they are. You'd validate the blurb. Is it a string? Is it within certain length requirements? And then you'd update the database. With Firebase though, and users getting direct access, what does that look like? Well, ignore the syntax for a second. This is a security rule for the user's collection in your database. And what we're saying here is we're authenticating the user. Does their ID match the ID of the resource? And does the blurb validate according to our requirements that we had? If so, we give them read, write, and update access. There's no reason why a user wouldn't be able to update that blurb themselves. When the user wants to call into this is what you'd write code for on the client. You would get a reference to that particular document, and you just call update by passing in a new blurb. It's as easy as that. Let's look at another example. Let's say you had a form on your site where a user could update their own email address. You might say this is pretty similar to the last example, right? An email is just a string, so it's similar to the About Me section. The big difference is that you typically want to validate that the user owns this new email address. That way you're not sending, let's say, marketing emails to someone who'd never given their consent. So this flow is a little bit different. Without Firebase, what you're probably going to do is generate a code somewhere that you'll eventually email to the user. You'll store that in the database. Then you'll eventually email that code to their new email address. The user will click that link, which means that you need something in your client to handle that link to send the code back to your backend so that you can validate it and update the database. With Firebase, what this looks like is essentially just one line of code. They have a function that you can call that is verify before update email. You pass in their new email address, and then Firebase handles all of that flow for you. Let's look at some of the pricing of Firebase. Firebase has a free plan, and don't pay attention to too many of the numbers here because these will probably change over the next year or two. They have a free plan and they have a paid plan, and the paid plan pulls from the free plan first. So let's say you do 100,000 document reads per day. Normally that'd be 6 cents, but it will pull from the 50,000 per day first and you'll only end up paying 3 cents. This is great for when you're getting started because you're only paying for what you use. And if your site has low traffic, you're probably not going to pay even a single penny. But at some point, if you start getting high enough traffic and your expenses get to be high enough, Firebase might not be the best solution for you. And at that point, you're part of Google Cloud Platform already. You could switch over to what they offer. So for example, you could rent a VM from them and maximize the utilization on there, especially since at that point, you'll know more about what your needs are from your site. Those needs, in order to have gotten to the point where Firebase is expensive, must have involved scaling. So let's consider a site that you might make where it's a local news site, so the people going to it are in your same time zone, and they mostly visit in the mornings. You might have traffic that looks something like this, where there's a spike in the beginning of the day, and then it kind of levels off for the rest of the day. In order for your users to have a good experience on a site like this, one of two things needs to happen. Either one, you need to have enough server capacity to handle the maximum at any given point, or two, as traffic increases, the server capacity also increases. Firebase does this second way of handling things. They will scale up for you. You don't need to worry about that, whether it's for hosting, their functions, or the database, and that way your site can run smoothly. Everything I've talked about so far has been pretty rosy. Firebase does a lot for you, and it's got some nice features. But there are still some downsides. One of them, and I'll talk about this more in the development environment video, is that the emulators don't emulate everything. This makes it just a little bit harder to get started with local development. The other, and this was a major motivator for me making this course in the first place, is that there is a learning curve. I spent many tens of hours just getting comfortable with Firebase, and then any time I had a question, just a small gap in my knowledge even, sometimes it would take an hour or two to figure out how do other people handle this. Pricing can be both a pro and a con. So we've talked about the pro, which is as you use a little bit of Firebase, you're not really paying a whole lot. But as you use more, you can pay significantly more than you would have on a different platform. There's also no spending limit. Firebase has the concept of budgets, but they might as well have called those alarms because all they do is they tell you when you've hit a certain spending amount. So if you set a budget for $100, you can still spend $200. Google's not going to stop you. There is a way to accomplish having a spending limit, but you need to write your own cloud function to do it. It's not just checking a box on the site. There's also no built-in rate limiting. Let's say a malicious user knows that you're on Firebase. One of the benefits I talked about earlier is that users have direct access to Firestore, to cloud functions, but all of those also cost you money. So if they know that, they could just arbitrarily call into your functions or start modifying rows in the database. And there's not too much you can do about this through Firebase itself. There are solutions for this. And one of the things that I found online just recently is that Google's own customer service, or possibly an engineer, said that If you encounter this yourself, let's say you see a 200% increase in spending one month, you can contact them and they'd be happy to reverse the charges. They're trying to do everything they can to protect you. It's just I couldn't find any information getting started myself on how to feel comfortable with this. It wasn't until I found that response from a Google employee. The other thing, and this isn't specific to Firebase per se, but if you're developing quickly and you're not focusing too much on infrastructure, then it's easier to get locked into this as a platform. And as you get locked into a platform, that means you're essentially accumulating tech debt that you'll have to pay off later if you ever wanted to switch. And again, the biggest reason to switch would be once you have higher costs, you might want to switch off of Firebase. My conclusion from all of this is that Firebase is a great way to get started. I got almost all of my site up and running in about 3 weeks, and that includes things like authentication and handling payments. After that, maybe if you've been running for a year or two, it might be better to switch off. It all depends on what your audience size is, the amount of traffic you have, and your costs. The way that I see it though is that it's better to get something out there and figure out what your real concerns are than to spend so much time worrying about infrastructure or DevOps. I hope you learned something watching this video. Thanks for watching.